Доброго дня, шановні учасники.
Good afternoon, dear participants of the webinar. We continue the set of the webinars, the local elections 2020 main facts, jointly organized by the project supporting transparency, inclusivity, and fairness of the election practice in Ukraine and the NGO platform of the human rights. My name is Alexandra Burgamin, Executive Director of Human Rights Platform NGO. I am going to moderate the discussion. We have two experts here to discuss a very complex but very interesting issue. That's constituencies, the ballots that are going to be used at the local elections 2020, and tabulation at the elections after the voting. We have two candidates of legal science with us. Mr. Wagner, he is also Associate Professor of the Public Law Department in Kiev-Mohyla Academy, и Leontiy Shepilov, PhD, member of the CSC, Associate Professor. And he used to be the member of the CSC at the previous elections. We had three webinars before where we spoke about the calendar of the elections, who is in charge of elections, system of the electoral commissions, and who we are going to elect at the local elections 2020, who can run, who can be the candidate, who can nominate, what's the deposit, what's the procedure of nomination, etc. The three webinars are available on YouTube channel of the Council of Europe project, and you can listen to them at the time convenient for you. Today we are going to speak about the electoral systems at local elections 2020, the constituencies and vote counting and distribution. Very interesting but complex issue given the number of claims with respect to the quality of the election code of Ukraine. And let me give the floor to Leontiy Shepilov to start our discussion with the general overview of the electoral systems at the local elections, upcoming local elections. I just recalled the quotation of one philosopher, Jose Ortega y Gasset. He had a classical work about the mindset of general public, and in his book he said that the health of any democracy, irrespective of the level of development, depends on one technical scene, small scene, that's electoral system. He said if constituencies are well delineated and votes are well counted, then everything's okay. If not, then everything is wasted. You can agree or disagree with the statement, but this stress that electoral system defines the type of democracy in the country is really true. When you talk about electoral systems in Ukraine through the prism of local elections 2020, we have to recall that the evolution of the ideas and legislation with respect to the systems was all the fight of majoritarian and the other types. So everything started with the majoritarian systems, and slowly, gradually it has changed. Similar situation is reflected at the local elections. If you look at local elections of 2010 and 2015 and local elections that are upcoming this year, we see the party element being strengthened, a proportionate element being strengthened when it comes to electoral systems. If I remember right, in 2010 we used to have the majoritarian, or at least partly, constituencies. Yeah, partly. But we had proportionate list. Let's look at 2015. We are going to talk about four systems. Two about local city and village councils, depending on the number of people, and 2, deal with the elections to oblast rayon councils of the cities and villages, depending on the numbers. In 2015, the criterion was not the number, and you see that majoritarian system of the relative majority in a single seat constituencies was about village councils. When you talk about representation of TC, then we are talking about the candidate, and that's going to be the representative of respective community. The higher the level of the city council and the constitution, that's Article 140, that defines that the interests of villages, towns and cities are represented in rayon and city councils, so there we applied proportionate system. You can talk for a while about proportionate system that was called with a German, Polish, and that was the one that was used in Petersburg to Duma. There it was hidden majoritarian system. Thank God we got rid of that, because there are no good memories about it. And when you talk about the elections to city, town and villages, depending on number of voters, it was either relative majority or absolute majorities that was defined in there. That's general picture. So relative and absolute majority, what is that? You can look at it at the next example. So that's the model that was used, and it worked with some mistakes, the disadvantages, but it worked. When we adopted electoral code, the first version in 2019, for the comparison, you can compare 2015 and 2019 and the changes there. We have a majoritarian system of the relative majority in villages, town and city councils with the number of voters until 90,000, and the question of relative majority. Let's go back, and then we'll move to this later. Relative majority. If you have multi-mandate constituencies, the number of voters until 10,000. That's number one. That's at the upcoming local elections. Why 10,000? If you remember, at working groups we discussed different options, including 75,000 voters. But unfortunately, whether that was political relevance or something else, it was decreased to 10, and only until here we use a majoritarian system of relative majority. Relative majority means that the candidate that got more votes with respect to others is the winner, at least one vote more. If you talk multi-mandate constituencies, there would be several candidates. Their number is going to reflect the number of mandates at the constituencies. So at the system offered, the number of mandates could be 2 up to 4 in each of the constituency, provided that there are up to 10,000 people living there. If you talk about higher level with more than 10,000 of voters, then the electoral code offered proportionate representations with open election lists. I think Volodymyr will speak about that more, but the general rule established by the electoral code, it is provided that in Oblast, if that's Oblast Council, Rayon, if that's Rayon Council, or a city, village and town community with more than 10,000 voters, there is one multi-mandate constituency that is divided into several territorial ones, and each of the territorial has the list similar to one multi-mandate constituency, and the voter then receives the ballots, and he or she votes for respective list, therefore voting by the party and by the candidate from the election list of the party that he wants to cast the vote for. The candidates that are on the list, they are candidates from respective territorial constituencies, indeed, and we'll speak about that. So I'm just providing the overview of the systems, and then we'll look at each of the systems separately. The systems that are going to be used at the local elections this year. Okay, so we can move on. The simplest systems that are used at the local elections, that's the elections of leaders of villages, towns, and cities. If the number of people is less than 75, then the entire community is a single seat constituency, and there we have a classical ballot when nomination, and the nomination could be from the party or through self-nomination, and the winner is the candidate that got largest number of votes with respect to other candidates within this constituency. The situation changes when it is an absolute majority, when the number of voters is more than 75k, because in this case the winner is the candidate that received 50% plus 1 votes out of those who voted. If none of them did that, then 2 candidates that received the relative majority with respect of others win, and then they go for the second round, and the winner under this system of relative majority would be the one that got more votes with respect to the other candidates. But these systems were used earlier. We just repeated things that existed in 2015. Anyways, if I remember right, these 2 rounds, 2 stages of the elections, I don't know if it is efficient or not, but in many cities and towns, the winner of the first round normally, well, often lost to the opponent. Well, if we follow the system of relative majority, one candidate, for instance, won 20%, the other 18%, and the others less, then 20% of the votes were cast for the leader. The others did not get any representation. So in the second round, they can redistribute the votes, and the candidate who lost in the first round but became the opponent in the second round could become a winner, has very good chances. A very interesting thing here, we didn't have these examples in Ukraine, but when you look at the electoral practice internationally, we can say that 50% that's from the voters that cast their votes, not from the total number. And in some countries there were instances when voters spoiled, destroyed the ballots, and if that's going to make a large percentage, then 50% cannot be got by any of the candidates, and we need to take that into consideration. Electoral code expects that while all the ballots would be cast by those who came to the polling stations. A second important element when you talk about electoral systems, when you talk about collegial representative authorities, that's the number of councillors of respective councils, because this number is relative to the number of the voters. So when we define this or the other system, when we define the boundaries of the constituencies, the number of the councillors is the key element that defines how many constituencies we are going to have. And if it is more than 2 million voters, then there is another interesting phenomenon added here. We'll talk about Kiev later, and the delineation of constituencies here when we had elections to Kiev City Council. So when we talk about the electoral system at the local elections with the number of voters until 10, then there are 2 important elements here. That's multi-mandate constituencies that are composed from the polling stations, or polling stations make respective multi-mandate constituency. How are they shaped? the number of councillors. If it is up to 10,000, then we can elect 22 councillors. The number of constituencies under this system is defined by dividing by 3. If you divide 22 by 3, we will get the respective number, that's 7. At the same time, when shaping multi-mandate constituencies, why 3, by the way? Since each multi-mandate constituency can have 2 or until 4 mandates, 3 is an average number here. When delineating the constituencies, we can deviate from the average number 1 plus or 1 less in terms of constituency. Then, since we are talking about territorial communities where there is a direct connection between voters and their representatives, again, under Article 140 of the Constitution, self-government, that's the right of the community and the right to represent a village, town, or the city. So the correlation is very important here. One council represents or should represent the same number of voters, and the electoral system underscores that. Deviation could be when it comes to the value of one mandate, no less than 50%. And the value of one mandate is defined by dividing the number of voters by number of mandates. If the number of voters is 990, we divide it by the number of councillors, that's 22. We will get the relative number of voters per mandate, and if before that we divided that by 3 and divide the respective territorial constituency, we have to structure and join the villages in the manner so that we could have roughly the same with the deviation of 50%, the same number of voters per mandate that we are going to have here. What if it is more than 15, not 50 but 15, my apologies, then we have to redelineate that. We need to take that into consideration by merging or spinning them off. The territory should be unbroken, but the polling stations should be shaped in the manner so that we could have roughly the same number. But we had instances, an example is here. What shall we do if the number is different? Uskivska TC, Izum Rayon, Kharkiv. When they shaped constituencies, territorial constituencies, local, that's number 1, Komarivka and Mykolaiivka, 472, they decided that one mandate could be valid there. That's violation of the law because there should be 2 up to 4, and in the next instance we see 2 villages, Komarivka and Mykolaiivka, that happen to be in the other election constituency with 4 mandates. So the issue of deviation, then we can answer to the question, well, 2 until 4 should be there.
Who is documenting these violations? The CEC or the parties, the competitors? In these situations, there were lots of discussions at the meetings of the TCs, which were formed, and they were forming these constituencies, and that's why the information was spread about this issue. But who has to respond? Well, that's a question which have been raised during the webinar. Which commission has to respond if the TEC is forming the constituencies not in accordance with the law? And on the other hand, the idea is that the actually hierarchical approach has to be taken to this issue, but the discussion is open because the top-level commission has been formed, the constituency, but these are about the deputies of the relevant village council. And the Rayon Council, which has formed this constituency, is not responsible for this village constituency. So maybe the CEC has to react and respond as a body which has to enforce the election law during the elections. But in this particular case, they have revised the situation themselves. Yeah, they did. But this issue has been raised again, and I think at the first webinar we were discussing the quality of the members of the TEC. When the new code was passed and it offered new procedures, and the territorial commissions have to define the constituencies themselves, taking into account the borders of the villages and also number of the electors, we can take into account the human factor and political factor, but this is a question of the practical approach. And in this particular case, the situation has been addressed and corrected. And actually the ballot itself, as I've mentioned already, when we are talking about the multi-mandate majority voting systems like in 2015 or at the additional elections of the mayors, we know this bulletin and the shape and the form of this bulletin. It has been used during the parliamentary election, in the majority voting system, in the president's elections and the local elections of 2015 by casting a lot, and we were actually took into account the names of the nominees by the political parties and those self-nominated candidates, and then the electors are voting for them. But we are, in spite of the fact that these are multi-mandate constituencies, we are voting only for one candidate. Here we are mentioning the gender quota. We know that the political party nominates the candidates. They have to into account the gender quotas as well. And this is not reflected in the multi-mandate constituency, but in the multi-mandate constituency, this factor has to be taken into account as well. We were talking a little bit about the gender quotas, and we with Vladimir were discussing this issue. And, everybody traditionally believes that gender quotas is the participation of the minimum level of the participation of the women nominees. In some regions there are problems with the men, actually, to nominate the sufficient number of men in certain party lists. Yeah, definitely. We have the information from different regions that we know the problem exists. But on the other hand, when we are talking about the TC's composition, we have a different situation. More than 70% of the members of the TC's are women. And there are, unfortunately, very few men. Then in general, the local self-government mostly is represented by women. At the primary level of the self-government, there are more women than men. We also were discussing the difficulties in tabulating of the votes, especially at the precinct commissions, especially we are talking about the gender approach. Well, it seems that women are more resilient from the point of view of, complicated and complex processes of tabulation. On the 25th of October, after 20 p.m., it will be difficult. And at the previous webinars, we were discussing that the CEC is going to model of the telling the tabulation of votes at the large and small precincts. And we still don't know how much time it will take to calculate all the votes. Yeah, the electoral code also defines just the procedure of counting, starting from the Oblast Council to the Village Council, but quite often take into account that in the field, the candidates, are interested, and also the political parties are interested in the results of the local elections, and they are interested to first of all get the results of the elections to the village councils, but not the Oblast Council. So it will be an issue as well. So Alexander, you were asking about how to establish the result. in the majority voting system of relative majority. If we have a multi-mandate constituency and, for example, if 5, 6, 7, 10 candidates have been nominated, but there are only 3 mandates, so these 3 people who have collected the majority of votes in relation with the rest, those 3 people are going to get the mandate. And well, if the election is arranged in accordance with this particular voting system. And this know-how of these elections, and this is what maybe for the last 10-15 years was discussed by the experts, and the necessity to implement the proportional system with the open lists. But people have different approach to this, and understanding of this electoral system which has been used in 2015 and the way it changed to 1919 and to what it has become currently is quite complex for understanding and for perception. Let us try to somehow understand what it looks like. When we are talking about the elections to the oblast councils, when we are talking about the elections to the rayon councils and elections to the territorial communities up to 10,000, we are talking about the proportional system with the open lists. Territorial organizations has 2 levels. On the one hand, it's one multi-mandate constituency of the oblast or rayon or the relevant territory of the territorial community within the borders of a single mandate constituency of majority voting. The subjects are political parties and they nominate one list of nominees. But the territories of the multi-mandate constituencies is divided into several constituencies. And here, relatively, we use the number of 10. If the council has 38 councillors, so by dividing them by 10, we get 3 constituencies. But there can be deviations by 2 constituencies. We cannot make 1, so these could be 2, 3, 4, 5, and it is possible to create those 5 constituencies. And in this territorial constituency, the subject of nomination is offering its lists of the councillors which are in the same list apart from the number 1. The number 1 is not being allocated in the territorial constituencies. Are they competing between themselves? It's an interesting question. Whether the candidates are competing from one party, let's say, from one subject of nomination, on condition of this step to change the place in the list is 25%. And here we can see a certain procedure. If we are talking about the large constituency, and the law does not disallow us when we are dividing by 10 while defining the constituencies, and we have 32 councillors in the council, and we identify 3 constituencies, we can make one of the constituencies very big and 2 smaller ones. And if this constituency is too big and too very large, there are more chance that this 25% might play. But if the constituency is small, most probably none of the candidates can submit of 25% and actually to be to occupy the higher place. And this is why this particular situation was commented. And we were saying that this should be not 25% by 5%, that it was discussed at the working group. And then this internal competition would be obvious. But when we have the 25%, then we can say, and the experts believe, that this is actually concealed, closed, proportional elections, because it's a big problem to be elevated to the higher level in the list of nominees. I heard that in a lot of regions, when the constituencies were formed, the parties actually, of competitors and opponents, there was a consolidated position to create as little constituencies as possible, and thus they need fewer candidates, fewer nominees. Yes, we know that in a lot of regions, certain political parties really do not have candidates, they don't have nominees, and because the number of constituencies is decreased, they were able to use their quotas. One more aspect, and take into account the possibility to nominate the candidates to two levels of the local governments. It was allowed to be nominated for the same candidates to the oblast and city councils, and thus, save the positions for their political parties. There is one simple practical explanation of this situation. I quite agree to what Leonti said, but let's follow up. We are going to talk about the numbers now and the allocation of the numbers. So allocation of the mandates is going to be made according to the proportional systems in the territorial constituencies, depending on the electoral quotas. And quota is going to be more or less the same, irrespective of how many constituencies there are going to be, because we calculated on the basis of the number of the voters. But the fewer constituencies they are, the more votes of the electors are going to be distributed within the framework of this constituency, and the quota is the same. That's why within the lists there will be more probability of these 25%, the higher probability that the mandates are going to be obtained by the candidates who are located in the party lists, the way it was defined by the parties, and the smaller number of the constituencies there is, then the parties will have more chance to ensure that their own preferable candidates are going to be elected. So this is a party political argumentation. Maybe it's not legal, but it's party political argumentation. But still, there is a question about the name, the open party lists. As for shaping up and forming the territorial constituencies, and they have been already formed, they had to be formed by the 6th of September, so here the law requires to abide by several rules. First of all, that the borders are actually is not broken. In Volodymyr-Volynskiy, there was a situation where they have broken the borders in Volodymyr-Volynskiy, and this case is possible by law, but rather than an exception, than a rule when it is impossible to resolve the issue differently. And when the territorial constituencies are being formed, it is necessary to take into account the level of the council to which the deputies are being elected. If we are talking about the Oblast Council, and they represent the joint interests of the territorial communities and the rayons, we have to take into account rayon division, new rayon division. Yes, new rayon division, you're right. And now we have fewer rayons, and we are going to elect the rayon councils for the first time, the new rayon division. But various situations might take place, and here we also have to abide by certain rules by forming the constituencies. If they're within the limits of one rayon, we can create several constituencies, but they are small. We can consolidate these rayons, but we cannot create the constituencies from different parts of different rayons or from different parts from different territorial communities, because the principle of representation is the territorial community, and the interests of thereof is represented by the rayon and the oblast. If we are going to destroy this principle, so we will lose the sense of the the local self-government, because thus we are going to destroy the principle of forming the representative local communities. If we are talking about the Oblast Council, we take into account the Rayon principle, but if we are talking about the Rayon Council, we are taking into account the territorial communities which are part of this Rayon, but the same rules work as far as the constituencies of the Oblast Council is concerned. We cannot take pieces of territorial communities and consolidate them and create the territorial constituencies. We always have to take into account this particular nuance, but we can consolidate two communities into one constituency or create several constituencies within one community, but they have to be adjacent to each other, definitely. And when we are talking about forming the constituencies in the cities without rayons, the situation is quite understandable. The principle of dividing by 10 within the deviation of +2, we are creating the TECs as the way it is convenient from the point of view of logistics. And when we have the cities with the rayon division, again here, the law reads that we have to intercount this rayon division in the cities and to create the constituencies within the borders of the rayons. If we look at the cities where these rayons exist, so by dividing by 10, we more or less are creating as many constituencies as there are rayons in the cities, and there are no deviations and no offenses. And we can take the example of Kharkiv or Zaporizhzhia or Lviv. This actually works, but there are situations when the local communities cover not only one city but also additional settlements which belong to this city territorial community. And the situation is interesting in Kryvyi Rih, where there are these settlements which are part of the city Kryvyi Rih. And when we are forming the territorial constituencies while during the elections to the city council, the law allows to attach these settlements to the city rayons and to create joint constituency. But when we are talking about the election of the mayors, and the law reads that the territorial constituency coincide with rayons in this system, but unfortunately the electoral code has not interpreted this issue. So the question is how they are going to vote, those who belong to this city, but they are not members of the rayon of this city. So the law does not address this issue, how they are going to participate in the elections of the mayor. So this agglomeration, as we can say it, can vote in one type of election, but in other types of the elections, it's questionable. The participation in voting is questionable. Why it happens so? I don't know. We have to ask the legislator why it happens so.
Another thing, when we talk about territorial election constituencies with rayon division in the cities, if it is more than 10 million of voters, when we have councillors with 120 councillors. So the question was governed, not fully, but at least covered in the legal framework, where it was provided that territorial election districts with more than 2 million cities are set up not with respect to rayons or by dividing by 10, but following other criteria. We need to take into account the number of voters within the natural and artificial borders, such as the railway, natural formations, rivers, lakes, mountains, ravines, etc., irrespective of administrative territorial division. So it doesn't really matter that there are 10 rayons in the town. You can shape constituencies differently. So the criteria that we should be governed by when you do that was not clearly stated. So given this scene, we have a question question of shaping territorial election constituencies when having elections to the Kiev City Council. How many of them do we need? There was a scandal, there was a row about that, right? We have 2 million voters or more in the city, and a lot of lawyers believe that it was unlawful resolution that is revoked by the CSE, or the one that is appealed in court. Well, whether it was lawful or unlawful, that's for the court to decide. On the one hand, the law provides for this model, and allegedly you can set up the constituency in terms of and the number could be indefinite. On the other hand, on July 30, 2020, the CC explained that for more than 2 million voters in the city, provide for territorial constituencies to match the boundaries of the rayon, though that's in conflict with the law. So we have legal provision and explanation. On the other hand, the law on amending 2 legal acts, there was some other new things where there was a reference to non-application of legal provisions, but this reference was made to the legal provisions that were missing. So I think that was the mistake of the legal department, but anyway, so the law was signed by the president the way as it is, and the question therefore is how can we shape the constituencies? On the one hand, if you choose the city council, so the number of rayons should match the number of constituencies and the number of commissions. If it is a Kiev City Council, then a Kiev Territorial Commission sets up 13 constituencies by the resolution of 2020, and we have 10 rayons in the city and 13 territorial election districts. So which commission should work where? So that's an open question. So, and that was the result of the conflict in legislation and lack of a practical application of the law that allows for these issues to crop up. As we said, when we set up territorial electoral districts, whether that's Oblast Council, Rayon Council, or City Council, the subjects of nomination can nominate the candidates that are on the general list. The number of them could be 5 to 12. Gender principle should be abided by, whether it is the uniform election list or in territorial election list. So Volodymyr already said that we have the floating magnitude of the constituency, because we don't know how many mandates of the councils will be voted for in a specific constituency. This will be clear when we count all the votes. When we have the election quarter, we'll know how many votes would be for one mandate, and we'll know how many mandates are won by the political party in this territorial election constituency. This is going to be clear at a later stage. But given the fact that we are going to have elections under this system, the practice of the TEC is proved that TEC, Rayon TEC, defined in advance how many mandates should be in each of the constituency. So it's not floating magnitude. They took the number of voters divided by the number of mandates and defined that it should be this many. The most important thing that it should match the number of councillors, respective council. It was wrong and it was revoked, but the fact of the wrong understanding is there, and it's kind of typical. We spoke about that at the previous webinars. One of the challenges for the CAC and other authorities, and generally for everybody who is administering the elections, is the fact that the elections should be held in most of the constituencies at least, because it looks that all the commissions have zero experience, whether that's CAC, TC, and especially precinct commissions that are going to be set up only on October 9, and they have to start counting on October 25, having new protocols, having new rules, and been guided and been working under the new system. And here we face the same old issues. When it comes to PSCs, normally members of the commission believe that despite the change of the system, election rule stays the same. So that's the way they believe. And unfortunately, when they are going to face the reality, that's going to be a shocking experience for them. Hopefully, it's not going to be the ground of mass refusal to work as members of the PSC, and they will survive with dignity through the entire process. But that's a new ballot, right? Well, it has not been approved yet. We just developed it based on what electoral code says. So that's the idea of opura that could be taken just to have visual image. So it's based on the electoral code rules. Add the latest version of it. Exactly. So what do we see here? On the one hand, left-hand side column, that's the list of political parties, the subjects of nomination. They are listed in the order depending on the casting that is conducted by the TSC. Then we have a square box where the voter should mark so that we could clearly see that the voter supported this political party. Under the name of the party, let's say party number one, the party of tomatoes, tomato. That's number one. That's the person on the election list. And if the party overcame the threshold, that's the person who would get the mandate from the party. The CC provided explanation as to the simultaneous nomination when the candidate to village, town councils could be number one in the uniform election list, which is a logical thing because you claim the highest rank within the territorial community, and that means that you have the political team with you that in case of victory, so you and your team will be responsible for all, the work in the city. Sometimes it's very interesting to read the political manifesto and then match them against the things that the party did. So number one, the title of the party, and then number one, then the square box, and then do you remember the indexes on the envelopes that we used to write in the Soviet times? I think most of the people forgot or don't know. Well, in the Soviet times, on the envelopes, we had at least the samples how to write the figures, to write the index. But if I don't follow the rule, if I write the number the way I would like to, well, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is that the pre-EC should clearly understand what political force, or rather the number that you wrote there. So the question here, if there is no strict rules or legal effects that is applicable to the way I write the number, why would we need these samples? Well, we would need that if it were automatic processing. If we don't have that, why would we have these samples? Well, ideally, e-processing is provided for, but they haven't been introduced yet, so we'll do it in handwriting. Electoral Code of 2019 provided for some samples in the ballot as well. It looked different, though it was of two questions: support political party under number, and you had to add the number. And then the second question, on the list of this party, I support the candidate under the number, and you had to write the number. So you had to write two numbers. In this case, we have the combination of the new and the old. And on the right hand side, we see the list of the candidates from a specific political force in this particular constituency. And there should be 5 to 12. All of them have 8, but you could have 5, 7, and then the person sees, okay, I want to support the party of cherries and the yellow candidate. So this this draft of the ballot, 6 entities could fit into the ballot. The length of the ballot will determine on the number. So 6 fit 1 page. If you have 20, then we'll have 3 pages. Or there's going to be like long kind of manuscript. Yes, there's going to be long one. When adopting these changes and when adopting the electoral code, we had the main idea to use the template. When the code was developed, the working group in 2008 and 2009 tried to use the templates only. When we worked with the draft law 3485 and tried to modify it and simplify it, there was an idea to come up with a ballot that would be more or less similar to what the voters have seen, with the name of the party, with number 1 from the party, and then somebody suggested in the parliament vote that have all the candidates. But when you have all candidates, then generally speaking, the template is no longer needed because you can tick the box next to the candidate. But what happened is that as a result of parliamentary discussions, we have both at the moment, and there is some kind of a danger at the moment, or risk that the voters on the one hand can wrongly tick the boxes here, but what makes it even worse, they even using the template can spoil the ballots to elect leaders of the communities. And if it is majoritarian system, and if that's less than 10,000 voters, the voter will get at least 3 ballots or even more. In 208 we have parliamentary elections going on at the same time, so there will be 3 ballots. The voter will receive this type of ballot to Oblast Council. Rayon Council will have this similar ballot. On the third type of elections, he will receive 2, the leader of the community and the councillor of a village council on a majoritarian component. So the highest channel, the largest challenge for DCs and TCs to comply with the code and provide for the information awareness of the electoral process, and we need to start working on that now to explain to the largest possible number of people not only how to fill out the new type of a ballot, but to also explain the difference between different ballots and how to fill it out, and to work with the members of the commissions. Looking at this type of a ballot, I just imagine the way the voter would see it. Well, if the voter doesn't know anything about it, it just shows up at the polling station, ticks the box, added the number, and well, actually, I am tempted to underline or add the number of the person I want to support, and then it's going to be spoiled in the ballot. If I don't add the number into the box, but will underline the name of the person, so that would mean that I supported the party rather than the candidate. So can you explain this nuance? When the ballot is deemed to be spoiled, under the rule, if that's the ballot that you have some questions about, then it is the decision of the commission to decide that. We can say that the CC is drafting the law and amending the electoral code, and hopefully the Parliament will approve that, where it is provided to specify some of the provisions and explain different options, how the vote can be counted in this or the other situation. From my perspective, the only possible option here is, well, that's a democratic and legal way, when the Commission votes on each of the ballots when they have doubts. Unfortunately, it seems to me there will be many of those. A couple of other things that I want to specify. That's September 14th. On September 5, we have the launch of the campaign, and we are talking about possibility of adopting yet another draft law that would amend the electoral code. Well, natural, that's a long Ukrainian tradition. If I remember right, at the presidential elections in 2009, we had amendments made between the first and the second round. But if we sort of follow the tradition, what the potential other changes we could face apart from the ballots? I've seen one of the draft laws, and most of the ideas that are going to be there are of technical nature, and they are covered by the draft law 3981 that has not been approved. We need to remedy that. Could it be done in the course of the campaign? We have to take into account two things, and as experts, as Council of Europe experts who work on that, the international standards, that's Council of Europe and the Venice Commission, say that you have to amend the legislation no later than 1 year before elections. And often we forget that the code of best practice of elections says that significant elements are not subject to change in the course of the election process. Let me just remind you what happened in Ukraine. We see the change not only of the election system, not only the procedure, but we have the territorial structure changed in Ukraine. In Ukraine, rayons have been established, the communities were delineated, and it does have an impact on things that have not been changed. Oblast Council stays within Oblast, but the new electoral system, new structure of rayons, all that makes a difference. So we violated the standards harshly. As to technical amendments, I don't think that's going to be really critical. On the contrary, they would contribute to mitigating all these risks and misunderstanding. Recently, we saw that the CC had to provide explanation on the parallel running or the issues of constituency delineation. It's not a very good story because the CC is the authority that is enforcing legislation, and these explanations are never ending, and the CC could expand the mandate it has. So when the CC is to respond to make sure that elections are held properly, then we have to understand that they don't have any discretionary powers and they can be contested, and based on the court ruling, potentially could be revoked. Getting back to the ballot and the way it should be filled out, it seems to me that the more we have different rules of accepting yes for or against, the problems would be more numerous. If there is one rule, then it's easier to teach this rule to everybody, including the Commission. If there are multiple options, then the Commission could potentially decide in this case this way, and in a similar situation, the Commission could decide differently.
And to remove from registration, it is possible prior to 5th of October, but it might happen that the nominee might pass away and he or she has to be deleted from the ballots, and then the seal should be applied and mark them as one who is not participating in the elections, and how many stamps like that could be put on the ballot? Yeah, the question is open. How many errors there should be and how to do it? Let's hope that nobody is going to be removed from the list due to such a sad reason, but the question is still open. And after the voters are voting in accordance with this proportional system with the so-called open lists, we can go over to the question of establishing the results of voting and to the relevant council. And only the party which has the organization of the party at the relevant elections who have collected 5% of the voters can participate in allocation and distribution of the mandates. But the mechanism is using the Hayes quota. Please tell us in more detail. And this is where I'm going to give the floor to Vladimir. Please tell us and explain us what is the Hayes quota. We are going to discuss it in detail using the algorithms and other things. If we are talking about this system, this open ballot list is a Ukrainian know-how to a big extent, because in the theory of constitutional law they are using the term of the proportional electoral system with the preferences, and this is a very correct name to it. And one of the experts in the electoral law, he says that using the notion of the open party lists is not very correct, because we are talking not about the door or window which could be open, but we are talking here about the preferences, and this is how we are using the electoral quota, and I am going to demonstrate how it works with the numbers and the examples of the candidates who have been elected. So we are ready to continue. Well, before we are going to start characterizing the electoral systems at the phase of allocation and distribution of the mandates, I would like to go back to the kinds of system, types of system, and we will see which is going to be used by us. Oblast level. The Oblast councils, this is proportional system. Kiev city is proportional electoral system, and the mayor could be used, is elected by the majoritarian with the majority. Rayon proportional, and the town and village councils heads, everything depends on the number of the electors in the relevant community, but proportional both for the council and for the rayon in the city council. The heads depends on the number and it's majoritarian. The same system exists at the level of the village, but there could be the multi-mandate majority voting system. We have to take into account all these things, and we have to say a few words about the following, about the peculiarities of nominating in accordance with the proportional system. I would like to demonstrate a very simple drawing. But if we are talking about the party nomination, the list of nominees is being provided, and this list includes all the nominees, candidates to the relevant council. All of them are being included, and then they define directly the number one nominee. And here at this drawing you can see it, candidate A1 and the party A, and this is the first nominee, number one, and he's guaranteed. If the party overcomes the electoral barrier, this person will become the councillor of the community. But all the other candidates are being listed in a certain order. What this order is, it's not alphabetical order, it's not by the date of birth, but this order is defined by the party at the meeting or the conference at the meeting of the statutory body of the party. So this order is being defined by the local organization of the party. Local organization, I would like to emphasize, but not the office of the central office of the party. But we've discussed it, yes, at the previous webinar, that it is being approved by the central body. But look at the right part, on the right part of the ballot. There are two boxes. There are two, but there could be more numerous depending on how many constituencies are there. On the nominees from the list have to be reflected in the lists of the territorial constituencies. They are being allocated, except for the number one. And please pay your attention to the following. Not a single dependence in the territorial constituencies and in the single list do not exist. Candidate A1 is at the second place, but in the territorial list constituency, he or she is at the place number 3. And the candidate A14, marked with green, has been lifted even higher than the candidate A11. So everything depends on the party, and it depends on the discretion of the party. Very important aspect is the following. The system carries out decentralized competition in the territories between the candidates within the single ballot list or list of nominees. When you are going to talk about this competition, please tell us about those 25% which we were discussing. I'm going to demonstrate it to you, how they are going to move and who is moving where, or maybe they stay at the same spot. This is a ballot of majoritarian system. It's going to be a normal one, usual one, and all the nominees are there in the of majoritarian system. This is the election of the mayors and the councils with the number of the electors under 10,000. So all the candidates in these ballots are being placed in the alphabetic order. And the ballot is going to be traditional for us, as it was mentioned by Leonti. Well, we have discussed how the ballot looks. We talked about the proportional electoral system and how the voter is going to vote. We have to repeat it so that we can move further and to more efficiently discuss the allocation of the mandates. The elector has to put the sign plus in the empty box and to write the number of the candidate which is supported by the elector. It could be plus or just check or whatever, with the help of which the voter shows or for whom he or she is voting. But if there is plus or check or in the empty box, but where the number of the candidate is missing, so the vote is going to be counted in favor of the party. It's not going to be lost, but the candidate, the nominee, is losing it. Why do we need that? I will try to explain it now. Who is going to tally the votes? That's the biggest problem. And I would like to talk about it now before we start characterizing the electoral systems. In reality, the major emphasis while tabulating is being done by the Precinct Electoral Commission, because there are objective and subjective factors. Objective factors, under the current conditions at the primary level, it is impossible to rig the elections. Even, smartphones can record and send this message at whatever distance. So any steps to rig the elections might bring about very negative results. And the efficient role to tally the votes is at the level of the Precinct Electoral Commission, using the electronic resources, engaging the representatives of the public, and cooperation with the other parties and the candidates. And that's very important. Somehow, usually, the war during the campaigning they continue waging this war after the elections have taken place, and they wage the war during the tabulation of the results. But unfortunately, it happens in this country. Well, we are going to have two more webinars, which are going to be dedicated to campaigning. But the political parties love to use printing the results of the exit poll at midnight on the eve of the Day of Silence, and they are trying till the last moment, are wearing the symbols of the parties and things like that. Yes, this problem exists, but I'm talking about over the control over the work of the commission itself. And also territorial commissions also have to be controlled, especially those who establish the results, especially when we mean the proportional electoral system, when the votes are going to be distributed not only between the parties, but between the candidates inside those lists. Let us talk about the electoral systems and the distribution of the mandates and tabulation. The majoritarian system, the mayors of the cities and the villages in the communities where the number of electors is up to 75,000. They're relatively small communities. Here we can see that the winner is the one who got more votes in comparison with the other candidates. Those who have come the first have won. But there is a deficiency. If the first, let's say, candidate gets 14% and the others got approximately the same number, nevertheless, the first candidate is a winner. The majoritarian one-mandate system of absolute majority has different requirements, and that is used for electing the mayors in the communities with the number of voters more than 75,000. The first candidate has to get more than half of the votes of the electors who participated in the elections, 50% plus at least one vote. Here I've written a little bit more because, people call it the first round. And this is a very successful example of the first round when we see the winner immediately. But in the so-called first round, there can be the following situation. We have a lot of cities which will have the second round. Everything depends, and not only on the campaigning. In Ukraine, traditionally, a lot of people, as a result of the polling, decide at the last moment whom they are going to vote for, and it's difficult to predict what's going to happen. But the only thing we can tell for sure that the absolute majority system is much more expensive because it envisages the second round. But on the other hand, it gives people to take a conscious choice. And the elector should not compromise at the first phase of the elections. But if we project absolute majoritarian system on the election of the council, so it also gives incentives to give more conscious choice at the elections of the councils. Because when the people are voting for one of the two candidates, well, the elector can vote both for the council and also support the candidate who has more votes. So if we don't get the winner in the first round, we carry out the so-called second round, where we establish the winner. An interesting story is about the following. For winning, one can get 50% plus one vote in the second round, and they also are established at the expense of the votes, of the ballots which have been given to one candidate. So if the ballots are being spoiled, they are not taken into account. So it is necessary to have the absolute majority, more than half of the votes of the electors. Well, if we use this simple arithmetic, the winner always have to be established. The only exception could be when there will be a lot of ballots which have been spoiled by the electors. This is exactly what I wanted to tell you. Going back to the new ballots which are going to be introduced, it is quite possible that people will spoil a lot of them if they do not gain 50% plus one. So what happens then? The second round takes place in 2 weeks after the first round, and there will be only one ballot given, and people will understand whom they are voting for. So I would exclude the factor of the error or mistake from here. There could be other issues and problems, and they could have emerged if there would be an option not to support any of the candidates. Now we don't have it. It's like a protesting voting. So with the majoritarian system, one single mandate, majoritarian voting system is quite simple. But multi-mandate majoritarian system is going to be used for the first time, and the councillors of the village councils and towns are going to be elected with a number of voters less than 10,000. How many candidates there are going to be? Unlimited number, because the parties can nominate as many as they would like to in the relevant constituencies, and the number of parties can be also very big. 145, 194 parties have been registered, and they decided to participate in the elections, and they intend to take the part in the elections, and also self-nominated candidates. And Leonti quite properly says that these self-nominees can participate in this type of the elections. And please pay attention to the following. In the first box, the candidate A1 has got 12%, B1 11%, C1 10%. So in this constituency, should we divide 3 mandates as it has been meant by the system? We actually explained that usually they divide the number by 3. And thus, all 3 of them are going to be the winners, and even other candidates have got not that fewer votes, but they are not the votes for them are not going to be taken into account. Does it mean if the party has got 5%? It doesn't matter. This is a majoritarian system. It envisages voting for a specific name, for a specific nominee. And this is the major know-how of this system, because previously in Ukraine, for the last period of time, only one mandate majoritarian constituency was used. There was only one winner. But here, having one vote, and each voter is going to have one vote, so there could be at least 2 winners, but it could be even 3. But if it will happen that the candidate C1 and candidate D1 would have got the same results, so then it will be necessary to carry out the second round. Similarly to the situation when we are electing the mayors. It's difficult to imagine such a situation will take place. So the votes, the results, not percentage, but the results have to be the same. And there could be different preconditions. And using the mathematical theory of probability, well, it's not very, it's not possible to happen. But nevertheless, the legislation envisages this. In smaller communities, and actually this can happen, but also within the framework of the mathematical era. If we are talking about the territorial constituency number 2, candidate A2 gets 80% of votes, B2 only 5%, candidate C2 only 4%, and if in this constituency there are 3 mandates, all of them with the relevant results get these mandates. And this also is one of the deficiencies of multi-mandate majoritarian system. Can you imagine that if one candidate gets maybe 50% of the votes, who is popular with the community, or maybe if they are electing the candidate to fill the position of the head of the mayor and the head, because they can run for both levels. And if they collected 80% of votes in this constituency, then the deputies, the other nominees, might become the councillors in spite of the fact that they've got much less support. So how many cases like that we are going to have all over the country? It's an interesting experiment which we will have to take into account, and we hope that the legislator will take it into account. So this is in a nutshell how the mandates are going to be distributed in the multi-mandate majoritarian system of the relative majority.
Proportionate system, and it's much more complex and in-depth. In one slide, you can't fit all the nuances. That's why we'll talk about the mandates distribution that is going to happen in several stages. The first stage is the most important one. You have to understand who overcomes the threshold. Despite preferences and voting for the candidate, anyways, there is, and the most important here is voting for the party. So the result that the party has is the fundamental one, is the crucial one. If the voter just ticks the box for the party and does not identify the candidate in the territorial list, it's okay. The voters can do it consciously. If they don't know the candidates, if they don't know the names, why would they? Why should they pick somebody up? They just tick the box for the supporter of a party. Within the elections of a single multi-mandate constituency, there is an electoral threshold defined. How we do that? The results of all parties, so the actual votes, the spoiled ballots are not taken into account. All of them are summed up, and 50% is defined out of all of them. The parties that overcome the 5% threshold are the winners. That's the percentage of those who took part in the voting, so actual votes, right? So, 5% threshold, those parties that overcame the barrier, this result is considered at a later stage. Those parties who didn't overcome 5% threshold, these votes are not considered in any way at a later stage. That's why in the right bottom line you see the results with 15,000 voters with 26 mandates, and what Lodi said, where TC in advance defined, and in the slide we have the potential number of mandates that should be divided given the number of voters, 8 constituencies, 1, 2, and 3. And that's just the model. But in reality, based on the outcome, the results, you can see what would be the types of elections where there would be ideal match that is maintained and it is proportionate. So at the first stage, we pick up the party. In our model, we have 4 parties, A, B, C, D, that overcame 5% threshold with a certain number of votes, and we remember them because we need them for the next stage. That's defining the electoral quota. What electoral quota means? In fact, that's the value of the mandate that is going to be distributed at a respective elections. The value not in monies and not in interest, but in absolute numbers of the votes. How the electoral quota is defined. There are several sub-stages here. Initially, you have to understand how many mandates are going to be distributed within this one multi-mandate constituency. The council is 26 mandates because we have 15,000 voters. From this number, we deduct 4 guaranteed mandates. That's 4. Why? Because 4 parties overcame the 5% threshold. The first number on the party list issued to receive her representative mandate. 26 minus 4, we are left with 22 mandates that are non-distributed. We need to redistribute them. So we also need to understand the total number of voters that will be divided between parties and their candidates. To do this, we define the number of votes for distribution. We sum the votes of all the parties that overcame the 5% threshold. So the winners at the respective local elections. You can check the numbers match. If you add all votes, I just modeled this out of 15,000 voters, 14,740 came to vote. Then we define the electoral quota. That's the sum of votes for the party that overcame threshold is divided by the number of mandates that are going to be distributed. Let me stress here, the number of mandates to be distributed rather than the total number of a council. You need to deduct the first numbers of the party list. The value of mandate in our model is 670 votes. It's not a lot, but on the other hand, that's quite a lot for 15,000 town. 670, that's the crucial number that is going to be considered later. Stage number 3 and stage number 4, and here we see the most interesting things. You have to understand how the mandates are going to be distributed between the candidates from each respective party. And here the electoral system suggested by the code new system provides for the interesting thing. The mandates are divided not at the level of a single multi-mandate list, but in territorial constituency. And that's the idea of preferences, so that on the level of territorial constituencies, the candidates should compete. How we define the number of mandates for territorial constituency that should be divided. To do that, in each of the parties and in each of the constituency, we need to define the number of mandates that the party can get in a respective constituency. So what do we do? In constituency number 1, let's say party A got 3,500 votes. The general result of the party, not the candidate, but the party, is divided by 670 electoral quota that has been defined. We get not the whole number with some decimals, 5.2, etc. So that means that we have 5 mandates. Whatever comes after comma is not considered because that's unused votes. In this specific case, 670 multiplied by 5, and the result is the result of the used votes in this constituency. All unused, 3,500 minus this number will be 150 unused votes. And the other one, the same, 300 whatever number of votes divided by 670, we see 417. The third one, 261. So I show 3 examples. I have a question on round in these numbers. We don't round anything because we divide within constituency only the round number. If it is 2,92, so there's going to be 2. And we'll have more number of unused. What do we do with the used ones? Used ones will be distributed in the uniform multi-mandate constituency. So they will be moved up, so they are not lost. But that's an example to show that it's hard to predict the final outcome of the election. So nobody can do that because when 001 would or could change the situation. That would mean that, let's say, one of the mandates would be divided at the one multi-mandate constituency. So the parties should value each and every vote and voice in a territorial constituency. That's important. At this stage, we defined two important elements. One is the number of mandates to be distributed in territorial constituency, and the second one is the number of unused votes that would be transferred to the higher level. We remember that, and let's move on. At the fifth stage, that's the most interesting one, and that's about competition that we keep referring to. What's going to happen inside the territorial electoral list of a respective party? And the lawmaker here said that we need to reshuffle it or rearrange it, change the order of candidates. So let me explain this by the example, and maybe that's going to be clearer then. Here is the orange square where it says, it gives the names of the candidates that are marked with some numbers, and in the yellow one we see the election results in the format who is located where. The movement along the list is happening depending on the number of percentage collected in relation to electoral quota, and all the candidates who have 25% and more, they go up the list. Those who received less, they don't disappear anywhere. They stay where they were defined by the party. And the election code clearly states that the candidates that received the result that is equal or exceeds 25% of the electoral quota should be at the beginning of the electoral list by decreasing the votes, to be followed by the ranging as defined by the party. So respectively, coming back to our model, in Constituency 1, Party A received 5 mandates, then according to the order, out of 6 on the yellow square, the first 5 will receive their mandates. Please take note that the candidate A2 was ranking the first, but he received only 5%, and he went down to the very bottom. If we didn't have this rearranging, then he would get his mandate. If 5 mandates will be distributed in this constituency, A3 candidate with his result 4% from the electoral quota wouldn't receive the mandate. If you had the range in the order of the party, he would stay the third and would receive the mandate. So that's the competition element, because within the constituency, all candidates from the party should compete with each other, and that means competition for the result, for the support of the voters. The discussion Leonti referred to was about the number that I mentioned, 25%. So that means how democratic it is to have 25% to rearrange the list. So 25% from the number of the votes cast for the particular party in this constituency. No, from 670, from the value of the mandate. So from, in our case, 670. And to some extent, that's an interesting number, because if we talk about the results the party has, let's go back to the model. The result of the party in the territorial constituency, for instance, is 3,500, 25%, that's from what number? From the electoral quota, from 670. So the probability for the movement is really high. Again, we talk about a community with 15,000 voters. If proportionately we increase it 150,000 to 1,500,000, turnout matters, then electoral quota increases, and then it would be really difficult to overcome this barrier. If it is larger community, you can discuss that, but when it comes to oblast councils, the electoral quota is going to be very high, and to overcome this 25% for the chance to move up the list is going to be a difficult thing. So, general principle that the higher the level of council, the less competition we are going to have. Can I sum it up like that? Well, in a way, yes, but small communities sometimes are more difficult to win 1, 2, or 10 votes in comparison with the oblast, because the relations are different there. So it's not for lawyers, it's for political scientists rather, and the psychology of voters or psychology of the crowd that should explain that. It depends on the community, but well, this is a very important element to be considered. We can say that this election process will give a lot of materials for the research and analysis. Yeah, we'll be able to see whether the internal democracy is there and it is working at the local elections. Okay, so that's going to be reflected on this ranking of the party list. Well, that's very important to see if that's going to stay as parties defined or whether it's going to change. So the mandates will be distributed on the level of territorial lists. All the remains will move up to the higher level. That's the 7th stage of distributing the vote. All unused votes in a single multi-mandate constituency to support a party are divided by electoral quota. From all territorial constituencies we collected unused votes, summed them up, and this result is divided by the same electoral quota, 670. The whole number will be the number of mandates that will be divided in the single multi-mandate constituency. And who will get them? If you answer the question who will get them, then there is an illustration to answer that. On the left-hand side, we see the uniform electoral list of the party. In the uniform multi-mandate constituency, we cross out candidate A1 because that's a guaranteed one, and we cross out candidates A2, A7, A11, and A15 because they received their mandates allegedly in the territorial election constituency number 1. And if they did get their mandates there, then they are not considered when distributing the mandates in the uniform multi-mandate constituency list. So we have candidates 3, 5, 6. And it's very important. Rearranging, depending on the results in their constituencies, is not occurring here. The uniform electoral list to the city council remains in the way and in the order as established by the party. And if you go back to the electoral code provisions, then the number of mandates is defined by dividing unused votes in the uniform multi-mandate constituency by electoral code, and that quota, and then elected are all candidates in the order of the list of this party and organization without taking into account those who received the mandate. Finally, I understood what magnitude is. So mathematically speaking, that's the number of people that received mandates in the uniform multi-mandate constituency depends on the wholes and the fractions that are calculated mathematically. If the result, let's say, is 2.1, 2.152, if it is 2.95, so that defines the number of votes that would move to the higher level, that would be redistributed. Then you can take two steps further, and the picture why do we need less constituencies would become brighter, because if it is less constituencies and party nominated a small number of candidates, we are talking about territorial constituencies, 5, because that's the list number. All of them 5, and in one of them there will be 12. And out of 12 in the single multi-mandate constituency list, one could be on the top of the list. So unused votes then in territorial constituency will be in the instance when people are missing on the list. And it is a realistic situation when mandates in the territorial constituencies are more than people on the party's list.
So we have 5 people, Party A, 5 people, and they have collected votes which will be sufficient for 7. So the mandate number 6 and their balance goes up, yeah. And then the mandates are being distributed in accordance with the order which has been established by the party. But if the party is not abused, I wouldn't give this forecast, yeah. Well, actually, we can model a number of these similar situations. So if we simulate a normal situation when the parties are going to nominate the candidates, a similar number of candidates in all the constituencies with approximately the same number of the electors, because it also matters, because the quota is being calculated for all the elections in one mandate constituency. But if the constituency is big, it's easier to get the quotas and the results could be higher. But if there are fewer candidates, well, I'm not going to continue. I can see by your response that I should not. From the point of view of the small number of constituencies, it means that the fewer constituencies are, the more mandates could be taken by the people who have been established in the list of the party in accordance with the order. If other factors are successful and properly calculated for this party, because the size of the constituency matters and also the influence the nominees have. Pay attention, please, in the territorial list, constituency list, if one of the 5 candidates is going to collect 80% of votes, for example, from the quota, or more, so all other candidates within this territorial constituency are going to go up, because he gets the votes for the whole list for this territory. But there is a question from the audience, Vladimir. We have to go back to the figure if the candidate has not collected 1/4 of the quota, so he or she is going to be included in the party list. So A2 is going to be the 4th, A4 should be the 5th, and the candidate who got 7% should be closing the list. Please give the explanation. Yes, that's true. They have to be in the order which has been defined by the party. Yes, this slide is used for my students. I am teaching my students and I'm trying to make them identify the mistake. If you look at the pink box, I have changed the names of the candidates as well, and the order of the candidates is the same as it has been defined by the party. So everything which is lower than 25% remains in accordance with the order which has been identified by the party. Yes, that's true. If you look at this slide, there is an interesting aspect. Candidate A1 went up, A5 with the result 28 become the second, and A6, in spite of the fact that he was the last, becomes the third one, holds the third place. Candidate A4, 7% result, and this candidate stays at the place where he was. So he is going to be the 6th one, the last one. A3 and I2 are going to precede him. Yes, that's true. They have to, A2 has to be the first among the rest of the candidates who have not overcome 25% sign. Mr. Yuri, you were absolutely correct, and you could have gotten an excellent mark in the course of the constitutional law course in Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And I would like to complete my presentation first. Let us complete the discussion on the single electoral list and the allocation of the mandates. The situation is going to become very complex and convoluted when the candidates will start to refuse from the mandates which they have obtained in the multi-mandate constituencies, those which are on the left. No, this can be also in the territorial constituencies. The electoral code at present does not establish all the detailed procedures as to how the movement of the candidates is going to be organized. From this point of view, it is very important to make adjustments in the electoral code and to take all this by the parties and especially by the electors. And remember that the result of the voting is not just a result of voting for a specific candidate under the proportional system, but it's a result for the party. If one of the candidates in one single list will refuse from the mandate, and it can be very realistic if such a candidate is being running for the mayor as well. And thus the reallocation, redistribution of the mandates might change. And the results are going to be somewhat different. That's why here we have quite a complex situation, and it's very convoluted, and it's difficult to tally the votes. And when I was projecting the slide and telling you who is going to count the votes, the precinct electoral commission is going to count all the votes. All these phases are to be taken to... No, the main work is being done at the level of the precinct electoral commission. They calculate the results of the party, and they calculate all the results of each the candidates within the framework of the territorial constituency and sends it up. And any error at any of these phases might cost not only the availability of the mandate of a certain nominee or deputy, but it also, the price could be a reallocation of all the mandates, because the number of votes which have not been used matter, and also rearrangement of the candidates between themselves, obtaining the mandate in the territorial constituency or a multi-mandate constituency. And to complete the discussion of this particular electoral system, I'd like to tell you the following. The minutes, the protocols on tabulation results are going to be very bulky, and failure to use even primitive tools of automatic counting might bring about very negative results and very negative impact. And could you please tell us, from the point of view of the logistics and organization of the procedures and the process, well, there is a question, maybe in the current the previous legislation envisaged that the tabulation has to be done without any interruptions. After the closure of the precinct, of the ballot stations, the members of the commissions should not leave the premises, but they have to complete tabulation and to submit the results and all the documents to the commission of the higher level. Does this requirement stay? Yes, yes. Uninterrupted process of tabulation is a requirement. And maybe the precinct commissions might more or less fit into certain time framework. This is a very complicated multi-level tabulation, and they will have to write and draw those protocols at various levels, but nevertheless, this is tabulation, and they have to come up with a number. But when we are talking about the territorial commission, they also have to work in an uninterrupted manner. So they will have to calculate the quotas and do a lot of calculations with the numbers. So how, at this level, we should create appropriate conditions to the people to work during, like a reasonable period of time, it's a difficult question, because using counting and tabulating without software, or at least Excel spreadsheets, will be very difficult. We were discussing these aspects at the previous webinars, but maybe we have to discuss it in more detail now. Take into account the fact that there is no special software at present for the local elections, are there? No, there are not. There's something like a CRM system or something, yeah. You've mentioned that even the Excel spreadsheets could be used, and they will do it on their own, the electoral commission, or are they going to be provided with some tools on the central level? No, I haven't heard anything about it. I know that there are several commercial projects which are almost completed development of these products, and they are going to be launched in a couple of weeks maybe. And these commercial projects and software are going to cost money, and the parties will use them to check the work of the commissions. And under these conditions, parallel calculation and tabulation will be very, very important, because each vote is going to cost a lot. So the nominees or candidates A2 and A6 will be very much interested to get a good calculation. But as far as the CEC is concerned, I don't have any information. I know that there were some ideas, and the CEC was planning to develop these tools. And the 3485 draft law actually envisages a certain basis for this work in using the electronic tools. None of them were launched, and there was even an idea about submitting the documents in electronic form from the candidates, and there were a lot of other interesting things and proposals. Well, whether these ideas were properly prepared for that, but the ideas were very good, and maybe we have to continue working on them. So, as for the tabulation, I think that the Central Electoral Commission should take certain measures, and this work has been started, but I don't know at which phase this work is now. I'm not working closely with the CEC, but they do have a working group, that I know for sure. It is being headed by a very professional member of the CEC, and there is a hope that this working group is going to offer some interesting tools. Maybe they are available already. But the second round, it envisages quite a complex story, and it might take place in two cases. When in the constituency the same number of votes have been obtained by two or more candidates of the mayor of the village or of the city, or the ballot included two or more candidates to the mayor, and as a result of the elections, none of them has obtained more than half of the votes of the electors who participated in voting. This is the situation you were asking about, whether the second round, when more than half of the votes are required from half of the electors who participated in the elections. So if it doesn't happen, then the third round is being appointed. And we were talking about the second round, and this is in the majoritarian constituencies. But here we are talking about the grounds of appointing the second round of local elections in general. And again, here, first of all, we are talking about the majoritarian system. First of all, and they can be divided into several general grounds, and we are going to discuss them in detail, all of them. The first ground is when some of the candidates have not obtained the required number of votes of the majority of voters, and the second one is when the elections cannot take place within the procedures which are envisaged by the electoral code. And the last ground, which we discussed at the previous webinar, and this is the emergency situations or martial law in certain regions. And this is the grounds for appointing the second elections. And actually, it might happen in relation with the COVID-19 pandemics, and other reasons as well. The martial law, emergency situation, and martial law are different things. We have to, if we are talking about the epidemics and the COVID-19 emergency situation, it is being introduced by the decree of the president on the submission of the cabinet of ministers. But if we are talking about the martial law, this should be done by the Council for National Defense. And thus we have the situation when the second local elections might take place. This decision could be taken by the territorial commission, the main territorial commissions, including the cases when, as of the day of voting, there are no candidates in the ballots for the position of the mayor, or the voting was considered to be ineffective or invalid, or it has not been organized in all the precincts. And there are a lot of other procedural issues which are spelled out in the code. Whether we will have such situations, well, it is difficult to say, but nevertheless there are grounds for organizing the second elections. And if we are talking about thereof during at the proportional system, there are two grounds in the code. In the constituency, the same amount of votes which collected by two or more deputies for the position of the mayor, and we discussed that. And when we are talking about the election process, the second voting, the second round did not allow to get the majority of votes of those who have taken part in the voting. When the first round is completed and the second round is completed, then official promulgation of the results of the elections is being effected, and it has to be announced in the mass media and official website of the Commission or relevant council. Territorial representatives of the CEC still do not operate, but maybe we will be able to do that in the future. And then registration of candidates takes place within 21 days, and since then they become the councillors, and they are preparing to take the oath of allegiance. I would like to go back to this phase and to emphasize that at the phase of the distribution of the mandates, we are talking about recognizing the person elected, but not getting the mandate. There should be a lag of time, and before the individual who was elected is issued a mandate, he or she can refuse from this mandate. Esteemed participants, viewers and listeners, we have a couple of minutes for questions. Maybe you have some questions and they emerged while you were listening to the discussion with our experts, while we were discussing such a very important topic. So go ahead, you have a chance to put your questions now. If there are no questions, so I would like to thank you thank our experts on your behalf who allocated 2 hours of their busy time to explain a very complex and a very important topic for us, which deals with the organization of the elections of 2020, creation of the constituencies, and also distribution of votes after the voting. The recording of the webinar is going to be provided soon at the YouTube channel of the election process of the Council of Europe. And I would like also to remind you that the series of webinars is going to be continued this week, and we are going to arrange several webinars during the next week. And the next meetings on Wednesday and Friday are going to be dedicated to very important topic, that is campaigning during the election process. And this is part of of the election process, and this series of webinars is organized and it takes place thanks to the project of supporting inclusiveness, transparency and fair electoral practices in Ukraine by the Office of Council of Europe of Ukraine and the public platform of human rights. So please follow our notifications.